They say history doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes. And fascism is one of those rhymes. It keeps showing up dressed in new slogans, waving new flags, and promising safety. The danger is that it doesn't arrive announcing itself with a swastika. It arrives looking familiar, often to protect your children, your way of life, and your sense of belonging. That's why it slips through so easily into our everyday, because it pretends to be the answer to our fears, when in reality, it's the slow erosion of our freedom. Which begs the question, will we notice it this time? You're listening to Fed Up at Figuring It Out, unpacking politics, culture, and global power. Every 2 weeks, we'll dive into a new theme, from capitalism and fascism to gender roles and red pill culture, and everything in between. This isn't an experts podcast, but a university student with a passion for research and ranting, and pushing through indifference. If you've ever thought, why does everything feel like bullshit? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Priya Migneault. As always, all things referenced throughout the show will be included in this episode's description. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of what fascism looks like today, we need to first define fascism. Because if you're like me, I didn't know what fascism was a year ago, which is quite crazy. And so, but it's a slogan, it's a term that's being thrown around a lot right now, and I think we need to just address what it is. So we're going to start with the 3 key phrases that make up fascism, which is authoritarianism, which is the promotion or forceful push of a people to become obedient to authority and or the state at the expense of themselves or others, often causing a suppression of personal freedoms, which is like freedom of speech and freedom of education. Nationalism, which is an extreme loyalty to one state and the promotion of its interests. There is also ultranationalism, which is the radical extension of nationalism that excludes and demonizes outsiders. So if you're not in the in group, you're on the out group and you're demonized, which is ultranationalism. Fascism, by definition, is an authoritarian, ultra-nationalistic right-wing system of government and or political movement. So we always hear a lot of talk about communism and how you don't want to be a communist. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a communist. But I think we also ignore the fact that communism is the extreme left, whereas fascism is the extreme right. And it's not nearly talked about enough, considering that we are swinging that way globally as a society. Britannica Encyclopedia finds that fascist movements often draw strength in populations facing economic stress, use scapegoating tactics to push public discontent onto minority groups, and we've seen that with Jews in Hitler Germany and immigrants today in the States, and we've seen that with every kind of group of people imaginable, honestly. It spreads ultranationalism, militarism, and racial purity. And so this weekend, I took the time to read Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us versus Them, just to get ready for this episode. And so Jason Stanley was recently a professor at Yale and fled to Canada over growing concerns in the United States and is now teaching at the University of Toronto. In his book, he describes how his grandmother helped save Jews from concentration camps by smuggling them out. And so he has a very long history of understanding fascism in his family alone. The key parts from his book, I think, that are important to highlight are that under fascism, there's this idea of the mythic past. And it's this perfect notion of the nation, what we're trying to get back to. And this sounds very similar to what's happening in the States, because it is. But it's not just the states that have done this. The whole concept of make America great again. The question is always, when was America great? And it's always like the mid-1900s, early 1900s. But the question is begged, who was it great for? And so this idea that they sweep it under the rug, it doesn't matter who it was great for, it was great, so we need to bring it back. And so that past never existed. There's no such thing as the past that fascists claim to want to get back to. It doesn't actually exist. And a large part of the mythic past is patriarchal, and so it conforms to these rigid gender roles as well. So men are in power, women are not in power, women are in the kitchen, or women have always worked, so working low minimum wage jobs, these different things. So It's this idea that gender roles are important in this mythic past. There's a lot of homophobia in this mythic past. There's no such thing as like gay people, or for that example, even like minorities. This past has like religious and cultural and or racial purity, and so there's no deviation in this past that they claim is existing, which is quite problematic. Another aspect of the book talks about how propaganda is key, and anyone can fall for propaganda. I could fall for propaganda, you could fall for propaganda. It's not a one side of the spectrum versus another side of the spectrum, but you're often less likely to fall for propaganda when you have an education or have an educational knowledge of the subject, which is why we are doing this podcast, so that you know how to identify fascism so that you don't fall for it, because it is super easy to fall for it if you don't see it. And a key part of the propaganda under fascist governments is typically to like push corruption off elites. And they mask corruption under the guise of anti-corruption. So again, the US is going to be cited a lot throughout this episode, simply because we're seeing it in modern day, and it's the most relevant example, I think, for most people. So in the US, for example, we saw Donald Trump call immigrants criminals. Generalization statements about immigrants being criminals. They are doing these horrific acts. They're the reason you can't find a job. These are all the things that they are doing. But we also know that Trump is liable for sexual assault, and I say that very loosely, liable, but he's liable for sexual assault, and he has 36 felonies against him. And so I'm like, okay, you're saying they're criminals, but you're also a criminal. And that's not, immigrants as a generalization statement are not criminals. They're not. So I'm like, why are you saying they're criminals when you're the actual criminal in office? And so it's this idea that most people who are fascist or fascist politicians are very corrupt. And we've seen that again throughout history. They are often very corrupt. And so their way of making the public seem like they're not corrupt is to say, actually, these are the criminals. And you're like, okay. So that's a big part of it. Another big part is anti-intellectualism. So it's this promotion of, again, if you see fascism, if you're educated on the subject, you're less likely to fall for it. And fascist politicians know this, and fascist leaders know this, and so they do everything in their power to undermine educational authority. And so nothing is ideologically allowed to go against the mythic past or the traditional values of whatever they're trying to promote. And this happens across universities. Even in like primary schools, they will start taking away certain pieces of education because they don't want you to know what that is. And it goes against what they're saying actually happened. So gender studies is often a high target, along with other studies on minorities, which is like African American studies, Indigenous studies. All these different groups are often targeted at the academic level to sweep that under the rug. The fourth piece of fascism that Jason discusses is it creates a system of unreality in which things are fake news. This is because they create conspiracy theories that create a rational sense to irrational feelings. So you'll often see fascist governments come up with broad statements that are highly untrue. And the idea behind it, though, is not to like make you believe the conspiracy theory. That's not the goal of it. The goal is to create suspicion and sow doubt about whoever the target is. And this has been done so many times in the last 10 years. It's unbelievable. But it's used multiple times to try and like sow this distrust. It's, for example, if I say to you, apples are poisonous, apples are poisonous, apples are poisonous, you're not actually going to believe me because you probably ate an apple this morning, maybe. But the reality is the next time you go to a grocery store, you might be like, that girl said that apples are poisonous. She's not right. But it'll go through your head and it'll sow just a tiny amount of distrust in what I'm talking about. And so that is the idea behind conspiracy theories and these outlandish claims being made. Another key part, though, of this is that if you don't, this is a modern day problem, honestly, But if you don't give conspiracy theories the time of day on news media, fascist governments or fascist people or people who want to believe this theory because it validates a emotion in them. Like if you're like, I hated apples from the beginning, they're poisonous. It's like, Kate, apples are still not generally poisonous unless you're in Snow White. And you just don't like apples. Let's just be honest. So you just want me to say it to validate what you're already feeling, which is a big problem. And media is supposed to give these people the same time of day as like actual news stories. And we've saw this a couple times. Like one example in the book, and again, picking on the States, but one example in the book is that the whole conspiracy theory that Obama was not a US citizen and was from Kenya, which is untrue. And yet, at the time, Trump was really promoting this idea that Obama was from Kenya. And news sites were like, we're not going to give you the time of day because that's not true. We know it's not true. Why would we let you talk about it? And then Trump would said that they are fake news. They're biased. They're government-ran media companies. Like these different things. And the reality is it's like, no, we just don't need to give opinions to illogical opinions. Like we don't need to give the time of day to it as media companies. And so that's another problem in itself. One quote from the book that I think is really interesting on the subject, actually. Okay. In Jason Stanley's article or chapter Unreality on page 69, I didn't pick the page, guys. Quote, attempting to counter such rhetoric with reason is akin to using a pamphlet against a pistol. Unquote. So you can't logic with people in this capacity. If people have clung to the idea of whatever conspiracy theory they want to believe, you can't logically argue it out with them. And so that's also the problem with fascist rhetoric, is that it often creates a very hostile environment to people who are educated and people who have factual opinions on things, because it's like, no, that's not right, because this is what someone I know said and my emotions align with this. And it's like, I can't talk to you then, because not like I can't talk to the person. I mean, I can't talk to you about this issue because we are seeing it from such vast different points in reality that it creates a system of unreality for people who follow fascist ideologies. The fifth point is that fascism creates this hierarchy of people who has more value, who is naturally better. And we kind of have seen this more and more, but it's the idea that there's a scientific and biological or racial explanation for who is better. And it tries to, this whole concept of it is natural law, tries to undergo and go against liberal democratic theory and undermine the obligation for equal consideration, which is a huge problem. I feel like this goes without saying, but like no one's above someone from a race or biological standpoint. And if you needed me to tell you that, I don't know what to tell you. The sixth point is victimhood, and there's this idea that something has been taken from the in-group. So you know how I said there's an in-group and an out-group at the beginning? The in-group feels like something has been taken from them or is being taken from them by someone on the out-group. And it creates this nostalgic longing for this past that doesn't exist. And so there's this whole victimhood. They're like, oh, they're taking something I was meant to have. Or it's like when any minority rises to power or starts to come close to equaling out the playing field, there is always this sense of victimhood that occurs. And it's not that, like, for example, it's not that women are outnumbering men in politics or that they're equal even in politics. It's this encroaching fear that they will become the minority. And I understand that fear. I really do understand where they're coming from with that fear, because it's actually psychologically very normal and very healthy to have that sense of like fear about being the other. However, it's not healthy when it causes you to not empathize or see the humanity in other people. The seventh point that Stanley highlights is law and order. And this ties into like, who is a criminal? What groups are criminal immediately? and who is in the in-group. So, for example, I would not be considered a criminal, but if someone was like, all white women are criminals, it's like, you don't have to believe it, but it's also ties into this idea that like biology and race play a part in it. And again, we've seen this with like the states, and it's like Black men are typically targeted. They have a higher rate of incarceration, and it's because they are a criminal. They're more likely to get charged for the same crime than a white person. Or Latinos coming, like Latino immigrants is a big one, and it's the idea that they are criminals. And it's like, they're not criminals. Let's just be honest. That's a very large generalization of a group of people. And yes, the odd one commits a crime, but not really more than a white person would. So let's just be honest about that. And this idea of law and order really tries to formulate an us versus them logic. The 8th point is sexual anxiety. And so tying into that idea of criminality, the worst crime in fascist government and fascist ideology is sexual assault on women. And it ties into this idea of patriarchal norms, of men needing to protect women, men needing to protect their children and their wives and this kind of thing. And so it ties into that quite heavily. But the concept is that the criminals are going to sexually assault your children and wives. And it didn't happen necessarily, but it was rhetoric that was spread in Hitler Germany, and even in like the United States with immigrants. That is something Trump has said, is that immigrants, I think it was specifically Mexicans at the time, are going to sexually assault people. And it's like, that's like the worst crime in the idea of fascism, which is really ironic given who is running the US right now. Anyhow, but sexual freedoms really scare fascists, which includes abortion rights and gay rights and all these other things that tie into sexual freedom that deviates from like men being at the top of the family and everyone else underneath it, and it has to be a man and a woman. That's like a whole fascist thing. 9 is fascists will typically attack cities and call them like dirty, I guess is the way to say it, and attempt to appeal to rural voters. And that is because cities have an increased amount of pluralism and diversity in them. And so you can't, for example, if my neighbor was gay and they're a gay couple, let's say, when a fascist leader comes to power and they're like, gay people are evil and gay people are why you can't find a job and yada, 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 and XYZ, I'm not necessarily going to fall for that as easily as someone who doesn't know a gay couple or a gay person. And so I'm going to be like, well, my gay friends, neighbors, whatever, aren't criminals. They're not stealing my job. They're not doing anything that I wouldn't do necessarily. So I don't actually believe what you're saying because it doesn't line up with my actual reality. And again, this ties into the unreality bit. If you were grounded in the reality of the situation, you're not necessarily going to fall for it. And this is not to make a slight against rural populations, but there is like less minorities in rural areas. And if, for example, you tell my uncle, whatever, that gay people are all bad, he might be like, yeah. Or like if you're like, trans people are weird and devious and criminals, it's like they might be like, yeah, sure, and accept it because they've never spoken or knew or talked to a gay or trans person. And it is easier to fall for it and easier to accept human atrocities and the brutal treatment of people when you can't see them in their humanity. The 10th point that Stanley makes is that fascism flourishes under economic inequality, and we have seen this obviously every time that fascism pops up. In Germany during the treaty signing, that was a wreck, and it crippled Germany's economy, so that is what happened. It often promotes individualism, the concept of meritocracy, private enterprise, and is designed to appeal to the businessman archetype. And so like that pretty much covers the vast majority of Jason Stanley's book. I really do recommend reading it. As you can tell, I had a lot of notes. Again, we tie this back to we'll kind of finish this definition of fascism, is that fascism is usually far right, authoritarian, anti-democratic, and anti-Marxist, which is ironic in some capacity because fascist leaders are typically elected democratically. Hitler was elected democratically. Poland and Turkey's governments have been elected democratically. The States is elected democratically. And so we've seen this, they come to power through democratic means and then work internally to undermine democratic norms. Fascism often promotes purity of race, culture, religion. There's only one idea that works. And don't get me wrong, oh my God, it would be easier if we all thought or believed in the same thing, but that is not how humanity works, and it's not how humans work. And so we have to accept a diversity of opinions and ways of living to survive. And you kicking people out actually is not going to help you in the long run. So this purity idea doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist for a long time. Even if you get to the point where there's a pure religion or a pure race of people or pure culture, it doesn't last. And you're not gonna defend enough or have enough fascism going on to keep it from extinguishing, basically. Another key aspect is that fascists often use opportunism. They'll shift positions or narratives to gain power, so they'll sell different lies, use different methods to gain power. And they don't really care how they get power as long as they get power. It's not just about big speeches and shouting. It's about control of culture, education, history, identity, and even bodily autonomy. So as we dive into this, I'm going to bring up a couple of historical examples. There is glaringly obvious ways fascism has presented itself in recent years across the globe. So let's just recap where it started and the patterns that kind of laid the foundation for what we're talking about. The first major one typically brought up is Mussolini's Italy in 1922. He was the first major fascist leader in the world. And he rose to power via the March on Rome with armed supporters called the Black Shirts. He used violence and populism to intimidate the government into naming him ruler. So he was not elected democratically, obviously, but he was the first major fascist leader. He capitalized on public frustration to gain support. Mussolini was able to take power through a method which other fascists would come to emulate by appealing to the frustrations and grievances of a population. Now, the most common one people have heard about is Hitler's Germany in 1933. He blamed the economic crisis and World War I reparations on Jewish people, which was actually the Peace Treaty of Versailles. And we don't need to go into World War II, but there's a whole bunch of things that led to it, but it was not Jewish people. He used dehumanizing language, such as vermin, and propaganda to normalize violence against Jewish citizens. This time last year, I wrote an article on the difference in hate speech in Canada versus the United States, and there is quite a bit of a distinction. But one of the articles I read was by a scholar named Mahoney, and the one quote that really stood out to me was this, quote, "The Holocaust did not begin in gas chambers. It began with words," end quote. And so it is this notion that people weren't just like, yeah, let's send all these millions of people into these camps. And again, a lot of Germans didn't know what was happening. A lot of Jewish people didn't know what was happening in the camps. It was this concept of people didn't know what was happening in these buildings, and so they weren't necessarily terrified or appalled. But at the same time, they were willingly sending, neighbors were selling out their friends and each other to these different camps because of the dehumanizing language and propaganda that has been spread about Jewish people. And Hitler implemented fascist policy gradually after gaining power democratically. Again, this idea that they undermine the institutions that they have vowed to represent. Fascism often starts with populism, scapegoating, and sowing distrust in democratic institutions. So you can't trust the government, you can't trust the media, you can't trust your neighbors. It's that kind of thing that they try to sow into you as well. Mind you, if you live under a fascist government, you might not want to trust your government, just saying. But fascism today There is one thing that I reminded me of this, and it's in Sabrina Carpenter's most recent album. Quote, "Bullshit repeats itself. That's how the saying goes. Been here 100 times. Selective memory, though." End quote. That's exactly what fascism is. Thank you, Sabrina, for your wise words, because it's just bullshit. And yet we keep doing it and we don't notice the signs. And so there's this whole notion that right now in the world, and fascism, I should clarify, is spreading across the globe. It's not just the United States. It's not just Germany during the 30s. It's like Germany now as well. It's a lot of Europe right now. And it's again, fascism is not conservatism. Like, you can be a conservative and not a fascist. I really need to clarify that. You can absolutely be a conservative and not a fascist. However, it's when you get too far into the right that you become a fascist. And you might want to argue with me and say that these parties, no, they're not fascist, they're conservative. Just watch. Just look at their language. Look at how they talk about different groups. Look at how they use scapegoating and conspiracy theories and undermining democratic institutions to get their way. And that is the difference, honestly. So, an important thing to think about. The past doesn't stay in the past. It resurfaces in new uniforms and slogans all the time. So as I was saying, it's not just the United States right now. It's not just Germany in the 30s. Ultranationalism is often what is like a pinnacle of fascism as well. And between Trump, Netanyahu, and Putin, they all have dubious amounts of ultranationalism, and they cling to power. The problem is a lack of empathy, of rationality does not make a good leader. And often fascist leaders lack significant empathy, obviously, or you couldn't dehumanize a whole group of people like that. They're willing to destroy everything in their path and cause unnecessary violence. And this is not strength. This is a profound weakness in leaders. So there's this whole concept of like the strong men. It's a huge thing called the strong men who will lead our country, lead a group of people out of the situation they're in. And I even had a conversation with someone during the last American election, and they were saying that the US needs a strong leader who will stand up, doesn't take shit, who will push people around to keep power in a global hegemony of power in the United States. And the reality, though, of the situation is that having brute strength and not caring about other people is not a strength of leaders. It definitely is a weakness, because if you can't lead from a place that doesn't require brute strength, and don't get me wrong, you have to be able to use brute strength in some cases. There is times that calls for violence. But oftentimes you should be able to negotiate your way out of things if you're a leader. If I'm going to elect you, you should be able to talk your way out of things, not dehumanize whole groups of people to do it, and just take accountability for the country. Like, that is the goal. So all of that wrapped up takes us to what the USA is today. It's not Republicans, it's authoritarians. And so again, when I said conservatives are not the same as fascists, Republicans today, well, if you're still a Republican and you still believe in what your government is doing, you're probably a fascist. But Republicans before the Trump era, I would say, are not fascist. They are conservative. And so there is a bit of there's an extreme difference actually between the two. An article by political scientist Matthew McWilliams, "The Weird Trait That Predicts Whether You're a Trump Supporter, It's Not Gender, Age, Income, Race, or Religion," that's his article title, kind of talks to this. It says Republicans subscribe more overall to the principles and values of authoritarianism, which is like blind loyalty, obedience, which is really ironic coming from and it's a weird dichotomy in the right, because on the right side you're usually like individualism, hands-off government, all that kind of stuff. Yet if you go a little further to the right, if you will, you'll find that people are often, as a lot of people are saying now, bootlickers. They will fall down for the government, fall down for the institutions. And it's like, yeah, okay, but that doesn't stand for anything you said you were standing for. So that's also very confusing. But authoritarian leaning voters gradually shifted from Democratic to the Republican Party beginning in the civil rights era. As Democrats embraced equality in race, gender, and labor and freedom, more people who fall or believe in authoritarianism, like government control, oddly enough, shifted further to the right. Trump's rise has only hardened this alignment. His support base is not a small band of dispossessed. MAGA is not a small band of dispossessed people. It is a mass authoritarian movement. And once awakened, it will be a force to be reckoned with, warns McWilliams. And he warned all of this, and he said all of this in 2016. And we are seeing, again, like this coming to pass. Scholars and political scientists have been warning about the US trend toward fascism for a very long time now, over a decade. And it is hard to understand, because if you look at the USA a decade ago, I would have been like, yeah, that would be crazy. They just approved gay marriage. But there was people already blowing whistles then. And so we can see how that's coming to pass. An article by the Hampton think tank in 2021 warned about Trump, MAGA, and authoritarianism as well. And this was before Trump's second term. Trumpist dismantling of the Republican Party, the undermining of rule of law, delegitimization of basic truths. Again, we see this idea of creating an unreality, using democracy against itself, using democratic principles and the rules created to undermine its own self. And honestly, it's kind of weird in some capacity for Trump because he's separating his support base so drastically as well. But yeah, it's just the complete dismantleization of the Republican Party at this point, because there are Republicans who do not side with Trump, who do not want him in power, who do not agree with what is happening. 110%. There are Republicans that are still okay with what is happening. They are still going to follow Trump to the end of the earth. No matter what is in the files, no matter how many people are shot in the street, they do not care. And that is a different problem and a half, but they're fascist, just so we're clear. In the Hampton think tank, it also says that fascism wouldn't find a more favorable set of conditions than those facing the USA today. Economic instability, vastly inflating the wealth of an increasingly marginal elite, while over a fifth of the country goes hungry. The blatant state-sanctioned racism, assimilating people of color, the disintegration of the rule of law and of socio-political norms, the crisis of democratic republicanism made clear by the rise of Trump, and the self-exposure of democratic establishment as unwilling to enact radical change. And so that's a big mouthful, so we'll just dissect that a little bit. But the idea is that, yes, fascism can come up anywhere, and it can come up fast. It doesn't have to be a slow progression. So it is something that people have to be very aware of to avoid. And the US has had, like every country, has had a lot of economic instability in the last decade, which increases people's discomfort. They don't know why things are. They're uncomfortable. They need something to blame that isn't them. And I think this really does tie as well into capitalism and the mindset of individualism. For example, if you don't make money, if you're poor, it's your fault. I don't believe that. But for capitalism's sake, if you don't make money, you're poor, that's your fault. And so people internalize that because we live in a capitalist system. We internalize that kind of guilt. We're like, oh, it's my fault. But I don't want it to be my fault. I need it to be someone else's fault. I'm the victim in this situation. How do I blame someone else? My own economic misfortune. And it's like people won't turn to the wealthy elite who are billionaires, which is largely the reason we have an economic problem. But they will turn to people who are marginalized, who are minorities, because the elite run the countries. And I'm not trying to say don't trust your government. I'm not trying to say, disenfranchise or make you untrusting of democratic principles and norms. But the reality of the situation is that, especially in the US, government, the corporations and billionaires run that government. And so people's misplaced blame on immigrants for economic problems is not accurate. It's actually the people running your country, which is a much more daunting task to take on than just blaming someone else who doesn't have a voice. Again, like the disintegration of rule of law, completely ignoring democratic principles, the Constitution, all those sort of things happen in fascist nations. We've kind of talked about the United States so far, but here are a couple other current examples happening across the globe, even in like my own backyard of Alberta. Fascism doesn't come back wearing the same uniform as we already said. It comes back disguised as patriotism, traditional values, and or protecting children. A big thing is always like, we gotta protect our kids, we gotta protect our culture, we need to protect our country. And it's like, those are all great things, so long as you don't fall for this. Like, a current example is we're seeing book bans and restrictions on education across the Western world specifically. Across the states, books have been banned, and here in Alberta, there's also been books banned in public schools. There was quite a large attempt earlier in 2025, and now there actually is a couple of books that are banned in public schools in Alberta. There's the banning of African American studies, as we said, feminism, queer books, and even textbooks that mention inequality or slavery have been taken out of classrooms in the United States. They don't want you to think that slavery, and there's this whole subsection in the US, which is crazy. They don't want you to think that slavery was a bad thing. And you're like, are you kidding me? Of course it was a bad thing. And they don't want you to know these things. So they take those books away. They don't want you to know about gay people. And I don't honestly think it's a way to be like, to not make your kids gay, to not make your child understand feminism, to become a feminist. It's a way of taking away a group's humanity, in my perspective. And it's the long-term almost goal of it, is that if I take away Black history, you're not going to empathize with Black people necessarily as well. If I take away queer books, and you've never met a queer person, again, if you've never met a Black person, this is what would happen, but if I take away queer books and it's the only representation you have of queer people, you're not going to care about gay people. Like, that's just not how it's going to work. And so media has such a fundamental role in how we perceive people and in creating empathetic links. So it's an effort to limit what is taught about racism, colonialism, and gender, in an effort to preserve this mythic past from question, from criticism. Most post-secondary institutions in the US were attacked last year, educationally, and restrictions on funding depending on the courses they were offering. Germany actually has done quite well in this sector since World War II. Germans are taught about the Nazi era, and it creates a clear anguish and guilt in German children. And people argue that, don't get me wrong, you don't want your kids to feel bad. Like, that's not, no one wants their kids to feel bad. But at the same time, this level, you have to understand the history of what people went through in your own country, and you gotta kind of take accountability for it in some capacity. So it is perhaps for this reason that Germany is the most stable liberal democracy in the world currently. When I did this research, that's what came up. However, I do know that there is some more far-right authoritarian parties coming to power in Germany. But yeah, I was actually in Europe during the last German elections. That was quite crazy. But the attempt to erase slavery in the States, or the Jim Crow period, or segregation, or the attempts to stop children in Canada from learning about residential schools to avoid hurting their feelings. Yes, I understand, again, but you can't erase the past. That is how it repeats itself. And children need to know that. The erasure of the past to create a new present reality is not okay, because the current reality is shaped by past principles and past actions. And so if you're not able to accurately inform people about what is happening in the past, then they're going to have a misconstrued conception of how the future and present came to be. Another quote from Jason Stanley, if you will. These laws have been represented as a culture war, but criminalizing educators' speech is not democracy, it is fascism. And this ties into the whole concept of culture wars, which we'll get into more. But at the heart of fascist political strategy was the expansion of state control over public and private life under the mask of popular support and common good. Another key example happening right now in the world is state violence. For example, ICE raids as instruments of terror Communities are made to feel unsafe in their workplaces, homes, and daily lives, a tactic of intimidation disguised as law enforcement. There is militarized policing and federal troops. The deployment of National Guard units, active duty Marines, and tactical units underscores how domestic order becomes confiliated with military control. And so that's another key example, is policing your own citizens. That's kind of a thing of fascism, guys. Over-policing of protesters. Peaceful protesters are declared unlawful assemblies and dispersed with explosive crowd control weapons and arrested en masse. And this is, again, happened many times throughout the Western world in the last couple of years, especially in the States with ICE. So paramilitary rhetoric and suppression of safety. The administration justifies its crackdowns as necessary to restore order and protect federal property, even when much of the violence is state originated. So a lot of the time in fascist governments, they will have these people who run the military, who are policing, start the violence first. It's not riots. Again, a misconception. And again, they control the media. So then they go and tell the media, hey, we want to tell you about this riot that happened. And it's like, you guys fired the first shot. Like, let's just be clear about that. And so that's another tactic of fascism, is like, they're trying to make it so it's justified, to restore current order, to restore peace. Very, very stormtrooper of them. It's takeovers as control under the guise of discipline. Schools and public spaces in other contexts may be reformed using the same logic. The design requires force. However, it has been shown that populism, authoritarianism, and fascism are increasing in both democratic and non-democratic states across the globe. The third key example is economic scapegoating. Fascists typically blame immigrants, minorities, and outsiders instead of capitalism and political and policy failure, which is usually the culprit for economic problems. There is a quote, a little lyric, if you will, by Paris Paloma. She writes the song Good Boy, and it's, quote, "Has any of the money trickled down yet? You say one day you'll be rich. Tell me how then," end quote. And I think that's really interesting as well, because people just want to believe if they work hard enough, they'll get rich. And the reality is that that's not quite the case. You can't work a billion times harder than someone else to become a billionaire. Like, that's not how it works. So it is a policy failure, a tax failure, all these different things that are leading to economic inequality. Hate speech is the fourth example. Hate speech spreads faster under fascism via social, and especially now via social media. Legal protections vary depending on the country you're in for social media, but there is no universal law on hate speech, and we can't allow it to become normalized, however. So we have seen this, though, with like Andrew Tate and the deceased Charlie Kirk and Donald Trump and all these other people who would fall in line with fascist ideology, who spread hate speech like it's nobody's business. Now, the fifth point is that there's a manufactured culture war. So the example is it really kids or woke post-secondary institutions destroying your life, your hometown, your democracy? Is that really your target? Is that really who you think is responsible for the problems you are seeing in your local communities? What's really destroying our local way of life and communities is classism and the ultra rich. And I'm not talking like millionaires, I'm talking billionaires, okay? Individuals, corporations, and lobbyists who control vast amounts of political power. Here's an example of what's not bringing the West and modern democracy to its knees. Gender studies, queer people, immigrants, women's rights, and anything else these leaders and many leaders seem to be blaming. It's not these minority groups or an education system that is causing the problems you are seeing. It is actual political policy, corporations. These are the reasons we have the problems we have. So it's easier to blame the weak link than the person driving the train. Like, you don't want to blame the conductor, they're driving, but it is the conductor's fault where we're heading, not the little links between the trains. Okay, guys? It, again, ties into us versus them rhetoric. It creates enemies out of neighbors deciding who deserves rights. Rights, I hate to break it to you, are not a limited resource. They are a made-up concept. We are not limited in how we give them out, okay? The next point is why people fall for fascism. Like, you're hearing all this and you're like, okay, Priya, I get it, but why do people fall for it? Fascism sells the promise of certainty, and we live in an uncertain world. It gives angry and scared people a script. You're suffering because of them. Vote for me and I'll fix it. Simple as that. When people feel powerless, it offers identity and purpose and direction. In times of crisis or instability, the script feels like clarity and safety. So it's a large part of it is fear and identity crisis. Fascism plays directly into fear, a fear of terrorism, fear of economic collapse, fear of sexual assault, fear of perceived attack on one's way of life. Matthew McWilliams' study of 1,800 US voters in 2016 found that education, income, gender, age, ideology, and religiosity didn't matter nearly as much as one thing: authoritarianism. Fear of terrorism was the only other significant predictor, but even that was far weaker. Fear plus authoritarian tendencies create a powerful magnet for fascist rhetoric. So if you're already like, I want to hold someone's hand to help me through this, and we all do not get me wrong, but your answer is to fall for someone who is blaming a different group as actually responsible, or to undermine democratic principles, is not going to help you. A scapegoat and simple narrative for complex times is often what it offers. People are told your suffering isn't random, it's because of them, the minorities, the elite, whatever. Even sometimes fascists will blame the elite. And I don't know what to tell you about that one, but they do. By offering an enemy, fascism channels anger away from the real sources of instability, which is inequality, corruption, systemic failures, and directs it towards people with less power and less voice. The complexity of global capitalism and structural racism is reduced to a simple, false narrative of an easy, digestible story for people. It also ties into ultranationalism and the lure of a strong leader. Fascism thrives by presenting a savior who claims to embody the nation. For those who feel threatened by social change, the strongman promises to protect their status and protect things. As one analysis of Trump's rise notes, his movement relies on populist appeal to the working and middle class white people terrified of losing their unearned sense of superiority, a sense rooted in systemic racism and discrimination. And this is not me telling you that white middle class people are racist. I'm white middle class, but it is a matter of like, I feel like I shouldn't have to tell adults this, but I'm not better than someone because I'm from the white middle class. That's not how that works. I'm equal to someone who was born in a third world country with nothing, who is not white. And I understand the fear around becoming the other. I really do, as we talked about earlier. But again, it is not the others that you're afraid of, and it's not the others who are the us versus them. It's not them who are causing the problems you're seeing right now. It is also this illusion of community. Fascism often offers a false sense of belonging, but always at someone else's expense. You can belong so long as you don't like them. Angry white working class masses have become the fuel of the fire, convinced they stand to gain the most from preserving the current order, even though the only real privilege is being elevated above marginalized groups. And again, we see this in the United States specifically because white middle class voters were the largest base for Trump's re-election. Yes, but you're trying to preserve your power over another marginalized group. So let's just reassess that maybe a little bit. They are told to believe that immigrants, queer people, or people of color are stealing what is theirs, when in fact their suffering is probably a byproduct of free market instability and exploitation. It's not the immigrants, guys. I really can't hammer that home enough. Another point is that economic instability and self-worth deeply tie into fascism. And a society built on individualism, financial hardship feels like a personal failure, as we already discussed. But when jobs vanish, wages stagnate, or inequality widens, people question their value. Fascism preys on that vulnerability, promising restored dignity while scapegoating others for systemic problems. Fascist leaders often wear a mask of populism, which is a public appeal to people, to draw in the masses only to consolidate power and protect their own elite class, to protect the ultra-wealthy. This will be explored more in episode 10 of this season, Populism and the Myth of the People. The threat of change. Finally, fascism thrives on the discomfort of those who see the world shifting around them, and the world is always shifting. As oppressed groups speak up and gain more ground, those who benefited from the old system feel endangered. Fascism promises to preserve the status quo, but the promise is a lie. The world is never going to be static. It never has been static. It has always been changing, even in this mythic past they preach about, and it will continue to do so. Fascism cannot freeze history. It can only unleash violence in the attempt. So where does that leave us? What do we do with this? I'm not saying you need to become an expert in political theory. I'm just saying you can't afford to be indifferent when fascism is right in front of you. It's the things we can do against fascism is truly awareness, is a resistance. Don't minimize the signs because they aren't bad yet. Normalizing fascism, it's super dangerous to leave it unchecked, because as soon as you leave it unchecked, that's when it just like whoop, goes all the way up. So that is a big concern. Just check different things. If you see warning signs, be like, okay, that's fascism. Speak up about censorship, propaganda, and control of information. Read books that are banned and ask yourself why. Why is this book banned and not another book? And do not necessarily, again, I'm not trying to disenfranchise you from trusting people and trusting institutions, but I am also saying don't believe everything the government tells you. Think for yourselves. And so if a book is banned and the government was like, well, it had sexual content. I don't know about you guys, but I read a lot of books in high school AP English that had sexual content and are not banned. And it's because they're written by men. But the reality of the situation is that you should probably think for yourselves, look at the book and be like, okay, if this is why it was banned for sexual content, why is this other book that I read not banned? Let me think about that. Is it because they're gay? Like, that's a great question. Educating yourself by listening to this podcast or educating others on how fascism creeps in subtly and not suddenly. It can appear suddenly, as I said, but it often is like there is warning signs. As we've seen a decade ago, there is warning signs about fascism encroaching. Fascist and authoritarian regimes never last when pushed into the light. I want to almost end this with a quote from Andor, the Star Wars show. It goes, quote, "The imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks, it leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear. The day will come when all the skirmishes and battles will have flooded the banks of the empire's authority, and then there will be one too many." Fascist regimes don't last because people have empathy and humanity for other people. And you can only try to push hate so far before people counter it, and counter it with enough light that it doesn't last. So truly the one tool we have against fascism is empathy and recognizing the humanity in one another. If I recognize the humanity in you, I don't want atrocities to be committed to you, obviously. And if you recognize the humanity in me, I would expect the same thing. So it is empathy that is the tool against fascism. Do not lose it. And it is hard. I understand empathy is not an easy thing. It is a skill, but it is important to refine and keep continuing practicing, especially during this time. Fascism thrives when we stop paying attention, when we let small cruelties slide, and when we stay neutral. Final thoughts. They say history repeats itself. I say we're repeating it because we refuse to see the pattern. It is no wonder leaders like Trump love the poorly educated. They are easy to control and less likely to see patterns of history repeating themselves. It is important to stay angry. It is important to stay awake. Read banned books, ask hard questions, Fascism relies on silence and compliance, and you don't have to be those things. Fascist leaders don't care about their people. They care about power, and it is normal to wish everyone would care about you. But don't blindly let someone into your life or into political office without making sure their actions match their words. Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you found this episode interesting and learned something new, send it to others you know, leave a review, and let's keep the conversation going on Instagram. When you review or share this episode, it helps the podcast reach new audiences and keeps the dialogue going. I'll see you in the next episode.